At 0730 on January 5, 1943, Lieutenant Red Cochrane stood in the Fire Control Center of USS Helena, watching four Japanese Val dive bombers climb away from his cruiser after their bombing run near Guadalcanal. 31 years old, 12 months at sea, 0 kills with the new shells. The Vals were already 2 miles out, too far for the 20mm guns. The Helena had just taken 500 rounds of experimental ammunition aboard in October, shells that cost $732 each, shells the Navy called variable time fuses, shells that weren't supposed to exist. Standard 5-inch anti-aircraft ammunition required gunners to predict exactly where an aircraft would be in 3 seconds, set a mechanical timer on each shell, and hope. The math was brutal. For every Japanese plane shot down over the Pacific in 1942, American ships had fired an average of 2,000 rounds, 2,000 shells, 1 kill. Cochrane had watched bomber crews load the new shells that morning. Each fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter, a receiver, 5 vacuum tubes made of glass, a battery activated by the shock of firing, 130 electronic components packed into a space the size of a Coke bottle. The Navy had banned their use over land. If the Japanese recovered a dud, they could reverse engineer the technology. But over water, 2 miles from Guadalcanal, the risk was acceptable. The fire control officer called out the solution. Cochrane's battery trained their 5-inch guns on the lead Val. The bomber was diving for the horizon. Standard doctrine said, let them go. Save ammunition for the next attack. But Cochrane had orders to test the new shells in combat. This was the moment. 3 gun captains stood ready. Cochrane gave the command. The first salvo fired at 0732, 3 shells, standard time fuses. They detonated 1,000 feet behind the target. The bomber kept flying. Second salvo, 3 more shells. These ones had the experimental fuses, radio proximity fuses, VT fuses. Cochrane watched through binoculars as the shells climbed toward the Val. No visible explosions, no black bursts of shrapnel like timed fuses, just 3 shells arcing toward a target 2.5 miles away. Then the Val's left wing separated from the fuselage. The bomber rolled inverted and hit the water at 240 knots. Total time from order to impact, 18 seconds. The gun crews stood silent. No one had seen the shells detonate. The bomber had simply come apart in midair. If you want to see how this impossible radio worked inside a bullet traveling at 2,800 feet per second, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories about the scientists who changed warfare. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Cochrane. The other 3 Vals disappeared over the horizon. Cochrane stared at the splash where the bomber had hit. His gun crews were asking questions. How did the shells know when to explode? Why didn't they see the bursts? What just happened? Cochrane couldn't answer. The shells had been loaded by specialists. The fuse technology was classified above his clearance level. He knew 3 facts. The shells contained radios. The radios detected targets. The fuses worked. What he didn't know was that 1,500 miles away, at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland, a physicist named Merle Tuve was waiting for this exact radio message, waiting to learn if 3 years of impossible engineering had just worked in combat, waiting to find out if vacuum tubes could survive 20,000 times the force of gravity and still function. Because if the answer was yes, the scientists at Section T had just invented a weapon that would change naval warfare forever. And 5 months earlier, on August 12, 1942, those same scientists had convinced the U.S. Navy to cancel all other testing after just 4 shells destroyed 3 target drones in Chesapeake Bay. August 12, 1942. USS Cleveland, newly commissioned light cruiser, anchored in Chesapeake Bay for weapons testing. The ship carried 12 5-inch guns, standard anti-aircraft batteries, and 300 experimental shells that the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance had codenamed Posit. Dr. Merle Tuve stood on the bridge next to the gunnery officer. 41 years old, 3 years running Section T at the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism. Director of a project that employed 200 scientists and engineers working on a weapon most of them believed was impossible. The target appeared at 0900 hours. A radio-controlled drone aircraft making a simulated torpedo run at wave height. Standard Navy doctrine required 500 to 800 rounds to destroy a maneuvering drone. The Cleveland's crew had been briefed. Fire 4 salvos maximum, 12 shells. If the drone survived, the test was over. First salvo fired at 0903, 3 shells with the new proximity fuses. The drone was 800 yards out, closing at 180 knots. Tuve watched through binoculars as the shells arced toward the target. No visible detonations. Then the drone's engine cut out. The aircraft nosed down and hit the water. Elapsed time, 7 seconds. The gunnery officer requested permission to fire again. A second drone launched at 0915, same profile, same distance. Second salvo destroyed it in 6 seconds. The test coordinator radioed for a third drone. The response came back negative. The Navy had brought 6 drones to Chesapeake Bay. Standard testing protocols assumed hundreds of rounds would miss before scores were achieved. 3 drones remained. Naval Aviation said they needed them for other tests. Tuve requested one more run. The third drone launched at 0940. This one simulated level bombing, 12,000 feet altitude. The Cleveland's guns elevated to maximum range. Third salvo fired. The drone disintegrated at 11,800 feet. The test coordinator shut down the exercise. The Navy had just watched the light cruiser destroy 3 maneuvering targets with 10 shells total. But the story of those 10 shells had started 2 years earlier, August 1940, when Tuve received a classified briefing from the Tizard mission. British scientists had shared their preliminary research on proximity fuses, radio circuits that could fit inside artillery shells. The British had made it work in unguided rockets, low acceleration, gentle launch forces, but the Royal Navy needed fuses for 5-inch guns, 20,000 times the force of gravity at firing, 25,000 revolutions per minute from the rifling. No vacuum tube in existence could survive that stress. The British thought it was impossible. American engineers at General Electric thought it was impossible. RCA thought it was impossible. Tuve looked at the British circuit diagrams and told the National Defense Research Committee he could have working prototypes in 6 months. He was wrong. It took 18 months. The first problem was basic physics. A 5-inch shell accelerates from 0 to 2,800 feet per second in 8 milliseconds. The rifling spins the shell to 25,000 RPM to stabilize flight. Any vacuum tube made with 1939 technology would shatter into powder. Glass components would explode. Filaments would snap. Circuit boards would disintegrate. And Tuve needed 5 vacuum tubes inside every shell. 5 tubes that had to survive the launch, arm themselves after firing, transmit radio signals, receive reflections, calculate distance, and detonate at exactly 70 feet from the target, all while spinning fast enough to liquefy human tissue. The solution came from a 26-year-old physicist who would later discover the radiation belts around Earth. James Van Allen joined Section T in October 1940, 26 years old, PhD in physics from the University of Iowa, 0 experience with vacuum tubes. His assignment was simple and impossible. Design glass tubes that could survive 20,000 times the force of gravity. Van Allen started by destroying tubes. He mounted commercial radio tubes in metal blocks, dropped them off buildings, fired .22 caliber bullets at them, shot them with compressed air cannons. 98% shattered on impact. The 2% that survived couldn't handle the centrifugal forces from rifling spin. He tried mounting the tubes in rubber. They shattered. He tried springs. They shattered. He tried foam packing. They shattered. For 6 months, every attempt ended with glass powder and twisted filaments. The breakthrough came in March 1941. Van Allen was working with engineers at Raytheon in Massachusetts. They were trying to miniaturize hearing aid tubes, tubes 1/10 the size of standard radio components. Van Allen realized smaller tubes meant less mass. Less mass meant lower stress forces. Lower stress meant higher survival rates. He redesigned the entire internal structure, mounted every filament on thick steel wire instead of thin copper, reduced the glass envelope to minimum thickness, potted the assembly in hard wax to distribute shock loads. The new tubes were 3 inches long, half an inch in diameter. They looked like oversized light bulb filaments sealed in glass capsules. First test at Dahlgren Proving Ground in April 1941. Van Allen loaded 6 tubes into dummy 5-inch shells. The guns fired. 4 tubes shattered. 2 survived. Survival rate, 33%. Not good enough. Van Allen went back to Raytheon. They reinforced the filament mounts, thickened the glass at stress points, added compression springs at the base. Second test in June. Survival rate, 41%. Third test in September, 52%. By January 1942, survival rate reached 58%. The Navy accepted those numbers. Production contracts went to Sylvania Electric. The company hired 10,000 workers, mostly women, to assemble the miniature tubes by hand. Each tube required 42 individual operations: wire cutting, glass blowing, filament mounting, vacuum sealing. By late 1942, Sylvania was producing 1 million tubes every 2.5 days. But surviving the launch was only the first problem. The tubes had to function while spinning at 25,000 RPM. The battery had to activate, the transmitter had to generate radio signals, the receiver had to detect reflections, and the entire system had to calculate range and detonate at exactly the right moment. The battery problem nearly killed the project. Standard dry cell batteries had a shelf life of 6 months. After 6 months, they went dead. The Navy needed shells that could sit in magazines for years. Tuve's team designed a wet cell battery that activated on firing, a glass ampule filled with electrolyte fluid. The shock of launch shattered the glass. Centrifugal force pushed the fluid into stacked plates. Chemical reaction generated electricity. Brilliant theory. Impossible to manufacture. National Carbon Corporation spent 8 months perfecting the ampule design. Glass too thick and it wouldn't shatter. Glass too thin and it shattered during handling. The final design used borosilicate glass walls exactly 0.015 inches thick, thin enough to break on firing, strong enough to survive rough handling aboard ship. By summer 1942, all the pieces existed. Vacuum tubes that survived launch, batteries that activated on firing, transmitters that generated radio signals, receivers that detected reflections. Tuve assembled the first complete Mark 32 proximity fuses in July, and on August 12th, USS Cleveland proved they worked. But Tuve knew one critical fact the Navy didn't. The fuses had a 52% failure rate. 48% of the shells fired would be duds. And if the Japanese recovered one working fuse, they would have the circuit diagrams for America's most secret weapon. October 1942, Mare Island Naval Ammunition Depot, California. 5,000 VT-fused shells sat in wooden crates marked with red diagonal stripes. Top secret classification. Each crate had instructions printed in block letters. Do not drop. Do not stack above 3 crates high. Do not expose to temperatures above 100 degrees. Commander William Parsons supervised the loading. 35 years old, naval ordnance expert. He would later arm the atomic bomb aboard Enola Gay over Hiroshima. His orders from the Bureau of Ordnance were explicit. Deliver the shells to the South Pacific, train gun crews, observe combat performance, recover any duds. The last instruction was critical. If a VT fuse landed intact on Japanese-held territory, enemy engineers could reverse engineer the technology. The circuits were simple. The components were available. Any competent radio engineer could duplicate the design in 3 months. Then Japanese anti-aircraft guns would have the same advantage over American aircraft. The combined chiefs of staff established one absolute rule. VT fuses could only be used over water, deep water, water where dud shells would sink beyond recovery depth. The South Pacific qualified, the Mediterranean qualified, the English Channel qualified. Everywhere else was forbidden. Parsons loaded the shells aboard USS Wright, an aircraft tender converted for ammunition transport. The ship departed Mare Island on October 18th, arrived on Noumea, New Caledonia on November 2nd. Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific area, met Parsons at the dock. Halsey reviewed the test results from Chesapeake Bay. 3 drones destroyed with 10 shells. He asked Parsons which ships should receive the ammunition first. Parsons recommended the carriers Enterprise and Saratoga. Largest air defense batteries. Highest probability of enemy contact. Halsey agreed, but added one more ship to the list. USS Helena. Helena had survived Pearl Harbor with a torpedo hit that killed 20 men. Spent 4 months in dry dock. Returned to the Pacific in June 1942. The crew had fought through 6 months of Guadalcanal operations. They knew Japanese tactics, they knew Japanese aircraft, and they desperately needed better ammunition. The statistics were brutal. In October 1942, American ships in the South Pacific fired 36,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition at Japanese aircraft. They shot down 58 planes. Average expenditure? 621 rounds per kill. The math was unsustainable. The Navy was burning through ammunition faster than factories could produce it. Helena received 500 VT-fused shells on November 8th. The gun crews received special briefing. The shells contained classified technology. They cost $732 each, compared to $12 for standard ammunition. They must only be fired over deep water. Any dud that failed to detonate must be reported immediately. The briefing didn't explain how the fuses worked. Gun crews weren't told about the radio transmitters. They weren't told about the vacuum tubes. They weren't told about Van Allen's testing, or Tuve's calculations, or the failure rates. They were told the shells would explode near the target automatically. That was all they needed to know. Commander Parsons stayed aboard Helena through November and December, watched the gun crews train, reviewed the ammunition handling procedures, waited for combat. Japanese air attacks came weekly during the Guadalcanal campaign, but Helena was never in position to engage with the new ammunition. The carriers Enterprise and Saratoga also waited. No opportunities for live fire testing. Then, on January 4th, 1943, Helena departed Tulagi Harbor with Task Group 67.2. 4 cruisers, 4 destroyers. Mission: bombard Japanese positions at Munda Airfield on New Georgia. Intelligence reports predicted Japanese air response within 24 hours. Lieutenant Cochrane's gun crews loaded the VT-fused shells into the ready racks at 0400 on January 5th. By 0700, Helena's 5-inch guns had expended 200 rounds of standard ammunition bombarding Munda. The crews were tired, the barrels were hot, and 4 Japanese Val dive bombers were inbound from Rabaul. The Vals attacked at 0728, standard Japanese dive bomber tactics. Split formation. 2 aircraft targeted Helena. 2 targeted the New Zealand cruiser Achilles. The bombers dove from 8,000 feet at 70-degree angles. Helena's 40mm and 20mm guns opened fire at 3,000 feet. Tracers filled the sky. 1 Val pulled up. 1 released its bomb. The bomb hit Achilles amidships. 17 crew killed. The Val climbed away at full throttle. Helena's gun directors tracked the retreating bomber. Range: 2 miles and opening. Altitude: 1,500 feet. Speed: 200 knots. Target angle: climbing away at 15 degrees. Every parameter was wrong for standard timed fuses. The bomber was accelerating. The range was increasing. The altitude was changing. Any mechanical timer set now would detonate too early or too late. Lieutenant Cochrane ordered the VT-fused shells loaded. 3 guns. 3 shells per gun. 9 rounds total. First salvo fired at 0732 with standard fuses. Detonations appeared 1,000 feet behind the target. The Val kept flying. Second salvo. 3 VT-fused shells. Cochrane watched the projectiles arc toward the bomber. No visible bursts. No black smoke puffs. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the Val's left wing folded upward. The bomber snap-rolled to inverted. The aircraft hit the water 2 miles from Helena. The gun crews stood silent. They had just witnessed something that violated every principle of naval gunnery they knew. Commander Parsons stood next to Cochrane in the fire control center. He had seen the same thing Cochrane saw. Shells that disappeared. A bomber that disintegrated. No visible detonations. Parsons knew what happened. The VT fuses had worked. The shells had detonated within 70 feet of the target, close enough for shrapnel to shred the bomber's wing structure, but the bursts were invisible at 2 miles distance. Parsons wrote the action report that night. First combat kill with VT fuses. Target, Aichi D-3A Type 99 dive bomber. Range, 4,200 yards. Altitude, 1,500 feet. Ammunition expended, 3 VT fused shells. Result, target destroyed. The report went to Admiral Halsey. Halsey forwarded it to Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor sent it to Washington. Washington delivered it to Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Merle Tuve received the message on January 7th, 2 days after the combat. The communication was brief. Helena, January 5th. 1 kill, 3 rounds. Tuve read it 3 times. Then he walked to the Section T workshop and told his engineers the fuses worked in combat. The reaction was subdued. The scientists knew the statistics. 3 shells fired, 1 kill. That was a kill rate of 0.33. Impressive compared to standard ammunition, but the sample size was too small. 1 engagement, 1 target, 1 kill. They needed more data. The data came fast. Helena remained on station near Guadalcanal through January. Japanese air attacks continued. Helena's gun crews fired VT-fused ammunition in 4 more engagements. January 9th, 2 kills, 8 rounds. January 15th, 1 kill, 6 rounds. January 23rd, 1 kill, 4 rounds. January 29th, 3 kills, 15 rounds. Total for January 1943, 8 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 36 VT-fused rounds expended. Average, 4.5 shells per kill. Standard 5-inch ammunition averaged 621 rounds per kill. The VT fuse was 138 times more effective. The Navy increased production orders. Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati received contracts for 15,000 fuses per day. RCA expanded their facility. Eastman Kodak joined the program. By March 1943, American factories were producing 40,000 VT fuses daily. By June, 70,000 per day. But the embargo remained. No VT fuses over land. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, refused to lift the restriction. Too much risk, too much investment. If 1 fuse landed intact on enemy territory, the entire program was compromised. Then Germany launched Operation Watch on Rhine on December 16, 1944. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. German forces launched the largest offensive on the Western Front since D-Day. 3 armies, 30 divisions, 250,000 men. Objective: split Allied forces, capture Antwerp, force a negotiated peace. American forward positions reported massive artillery barrages at 0530. German infantry advanced through heavy fog. Panzers followed. Within 12 hours, German forces had penetrated 15 miles into American lines. The weather was brutal. Heavy cloud cover grounded Allied air support. American artillery was the only counter-battery option available. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, reviewed the situation at SHAEF headquarters on December 18th. American forces were outnumbered. Air support was impossible. Artillery was critical. Eisenhower asked his ordnance staff about VT fuses, the shells that had devastated Japanese aircraft in the Pacific, the shells that turned near misses into kills. The answer was negative. VT fuses were still under embargo. No use over land. Too much risk of enemy recovery. Admiral King's directive remained in force. Pacific theater only. Deep water only. Eisenhower overruled King. December 18, 1944. 200,000 VT-fused artillery shells were released for immediate deployment to Europe. The embargo was lifted. American artillery batteries could fire the fuses over enemy-held territory. The risk was acceptable because German forces were in full retreat everywhere except the Ardennes. Even if they recovered a dud fuse, they lacked the industrial capacity to produce them. The shells arrived at forward artillery positions on December 20th. Gun crews received emergency briefing. The fuses would detonate automatically at preset height above ground. Standard setting, 10 to 15 feet. The burst pattern would create a cone of shrapnel spreading downward and outward. Maximum effectiveness against infantry and unarmored vehicles in open terrain. 3rd Army under General George Patton received 50,000 rounds. Patton's artillery battalions were moving north to relieve American forces surrounded at Bastogne. The weather finally cleared on December 23rd. Allied air support resumed, but Patton's artillery got there first. Colonel George Axelson commanded the 406th Artillery Group supporting the 38th Cavalry Squadron near Monschau. German infantry were advancing through open ground. Standard artillery doctrine called for contact fuses that detonated on impact, effective against fortifications, poor against dispersed infantry. The explosions created craters. The shrapnel went sideways and up. Soldiers in trenches or behind cover survived. Axelson ordered VT fuses, set for 12 feet detonation height. His batteries fired at 0900 on December 23rd. The first shells detonated above the advancing German column. The shrapnel rained down from above. No cover was effective. Trenches didn't matter. Trees didn't matter. The Germans were caught in the open. After-action reports documented 702 German casualties from one artillery barrage, 1 battalion, 20 minutes of fire, 800 VT-fused rounds. The German advance stopped. Survivors refused to leave their bunkers during subsequent barrages. Patton witnessed similar results near the Sauer River on December 26th. German forces attempting to cross were hit with VT-fused artillery. The shells detonated 15 feet above the water. Shrapnel swept the riverbanks. The crossing failed. Patton wrote to the War Department that night. His message was brief and direct. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad that you all thought of it first. By January 1945, American artillery had fired 5 million VT-fused shells in Europe. German prisoners described the attacks as indefensible. No fortification worked. No cover was adequate. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical casualties. But the VT fuse's greatest contribution was still occurring in the Pacific, where Japanese forces had developed one final, desperate tactic against American naval supremacy. October 25, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, issued orders to his remaining pilots. Standard dive bombing and torpedo attacks were no longer effective. American radar detected incoming aircraft at 60 miles. American combat air patrols intercepted bombers before they reached the fleet. American anti-aircraft fire, now equipped with VT fuses, destroyed aircraft that penetrated the defensive screen. Onishi's solution was direct. Pilots would deliberately crash their aircraft into American ships. Guaranteed hits, maximum damage. The tactic was called Shinpu, divine wind. Americans called it kamikaze. The first organized kamikaze attack occurred on October 25th. 13 Mitsubishi Zero fighters loaded with bombs attacked escort carriers off Samar. 5 carriers were hit. 1 sank. The tactic worked because kamikaze aircraft didn't need to survive. They didn't need to escape. They just needed to reach the target. American gun directors faced a new problem. Standard intercept doctrine assumed aircraft would take evasive action when fired upon. Gun directors calculated lead angles based on aircraft attempting to survive. Kamikazes didn't evade. They flew straight at their targets. The calculations were simpler, but the closing speed was faster, and the consequences of missing were catastrophic. VT-fused ammunition became critical. Standard timed fuses required gunners to predict the intercept point 3 seconds in advance. Kamikazes changed course constantly in the final approach. Speed varied, altitude varied. Any miscalculation meant the shell detonated too early or too late. VT fuses eliminated the prediction requirement. The shells detonated automatically when they detected the target. The effectiveness data was stark. Between October 1944 and August 1945, American ships in the Pacific fired VT-fused ammunition at 278 kamikaze aircraft. Analysis showed only 46 would have been destroyed using standard timed fuses. The VT fuse increased kill rate by 6 to 1. The Battle of Okinawa demonstrated the full scale of the kamikaze threat. April through June 1945. Japanese forces launched over 1,500 kamikaze attacks against the American fleet. 26 ships sunk, 164 damaged, 4,900 American sailors killed. More casualties than any previous naval campaign in the Pacific. VT fuses couldn't stop every kamikaze. The aircraft were too fast, the approach was too direct, but they increased the defensive effectiveness enough to prevent catastrophic fleet losses. Destroyers on radar picket duty fired VT-fused ammunition almost exclusively. Their survival depended on it. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded destroyer squadrons in the Pacific, later described the impact. When VT fuses became standard ammunition, kill rates against kamikaze aircraft doubled. Ships that would have been overwhelmed survived. The mathematical advantage shifted back to the defenders. By war's end, American factories had produced 22 million VT fuses. Total program cost exceeded $1 billion in 1945 currency. Over 100 factories were involved in production. Sylvania alone employed 10,000 workers manufacturing the miniature vacuum tubes. The program consumed 3% of all physicists in the United States. The fuses were used in 5-inch naval guns, Army artillery from 75mm to 240mm, British naval guns, and experimental rocket applications. They shot down Japanese aircraft over the Pacific. They devastated German infantry in the Ardennes. They defended London against V-1 flying bombs, achieving a 79% kill rate. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal called it the weapon that helped blaze the trail to Japan. General George Patton said it required a complete revision of land warfare tactics. Vannevar Bush, director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, credited the proximity fuse with 3 significant effects on the war. And it all started with one impossible engineering challenge. Put a radio inside a bullet. Make it survive forces that would crush a human body. Make it work while spinning fast enough to tear steel apart. Then build 22 million of them. Merle Tuvey never received public recognition during the war. The VT Fuse program remained classified until September 1945. He returned to the Carnegie Institution, continued research in geophysics, and died in 1982. His obituaries mentioned the proximity fuse in passing. James Van Allen became famous for discovering radiation belts surrounding Earth in 1958, the Van Allen belts. Few people knew he had spent a year making glass tubes survive 20,000 times the force of gravity. Lieutenant Red Cochrane survived the war and left the Navy in 1946. The official records don't mention he fired the first VT fuse shells in combat. That information remained classified for 3 years. USS Helena was sunk at the Battle of Kula Gulf on July 6, 1943. Japanese torpedoes sent her down in 20 minutes. 168 crew killed. The wreck was discovered in 2018, resting in 300 feet of water in the Solomon Islands. The technology didn't end with World War II. Modern anti-aircraft missiles use radar proximity fuses, the Patriot missile, the Standard missile, the AIM-54 Phoenix. The principles developed by Section T still protect naval vessels today. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about scientists and engineers who saved lives with vacuum tubes and radios and impossible engineering. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Merle Tuvey, James Van Allen, and the Section T team don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.